Good morning, Mr. Arlinghouse. Forgive my long absence, and especially considering what we still have to cover. So let's get on with this. Today is April the 7th, and we're still talking about the Great Depression, but remember as how it reflected in European history. And so let's begin, shall we? Roman numeral 12. Nazi economic policy was, of course, tested by the Great Depression. The Nazis, however, were able to make unemployment by 1936 a non-issue. I mean, how did the Nazis come to power in Germany? There's your answer. You know, the putting people to work, giving people confidence, something that was not happening pretty much in all the rest of the world. Hitler had become the most effective leader in Europe, taking economic policies in effect. Yeah, I mean, that's high praise. Effective. This gave the Nazis immediate credibility amongst the German people, but at the sacrifice of civil liberties and freedoms. I mean, the Nazis had already been eliminating competition, shall we say, eliminating sources of trouble for them, shall we say. Nazi economic policy, though, these are the kind of things they hit on in AP Euro. Maintain private property and private capitalism, but subordinated all other economic goals to the goals of the state. Okay, you get to own that, they say, but you're going to do with it what we tell you to do with it. It is a directed economy. The Nazis spent money to rebuild the country in contrast to what other governments had done, such as, the Autobahn. Now, the Autobahn is the grandfather of our own interstate highway system. In fact, Dwight David Eisenhower, when he went to Germany as the commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, he got to see this Autobahn, in use firsthand, and what a advantage it was to be able to move large numbers of soldiers on a limited access highway at high speeds. I mean, that's why the interstate highway system was created. Do you really think they created the interstate highway system so you could drive to Florida, Mr. Arlinghouse? No, it was created originally by Dwight David Eisenhower as a means of, in this country, of being able to transport defense materials, soldiers, supplies, whatever, from one part of the country to the other as quickly as possible. I mean, for example, I don't want to go too far into this, but before the birth of I-75, Mr. Arlinghouse, it used to take you 2.5 days to drive from here to Florida. The main road was 25, Dixie Highway, and that runs all the way to Miami, but curves, stoplights, towns, slowdowns, farms, Anyway, public works, canal building. The Nazis built canals. And they also did other things too. They remember the Nazis created the Volkswagen, a cheap automobile that the people could drive. The Nazis created Fanta soft drink because, Mr. Arlinghouse, they created Fanta because of an embargo. They could not get this. The syrup to make this stuff was banned, and so the Nazis had to get creative. What's funny though, Mr. Arlinghouse, is that Coca-Cola retained the rights to Fanta. I mean, the guy who in Nazi Germany who invented Fanta was Coca-Cola's man in Germany, and he creates this, and Coca-Cola then held on to the international marketing rights because Fanta is a fairly popular drink in Europe today. But of course, Mr. Arlinghouse, you and I know nobody beats number one. And thank you again. Canal building. They built a series of canals to improve transportation. In 1935, Hitler renounced the military terms of the Treaty of Versailles, something that, of course, gained widespread support all across Germany for obvious reasons. He geared the nation's economy to prepare the country for a coming war. Trade unions were crushed, outlawed, because trade unions can make trouble. Strikes outlawed in 1933. Government handled all labor negotiation through forced arbitration. Forced arbitration. All workers had to join the labor front to show that class conflict was over. The labor front sponsored a Strength Through Joy. Now, that is a program. I've seen that before in test, Mr. Arlinghouse. And you say, what is it? The Nazis brought a lot of innovations. For example, as it says there, 6 weeks vacation. Not 6 weeks, but, compulsory vacations. All workers got vacations. And all of it kind of public programs, opening of parks, things of that nature, that, as I said, made joy. Strength through joy. Now, Italy's government, on the other hand, wasn't quite so successful. Here's the interesting thing, Mr. Arlinghouse. So when you got to remember that Benito Mussolini rises to power in Italy before Adolf Hitler does in Germany. And at first, Mussolini, and they're both fascists. At first, Mussolini is the teacher and Adolf Hitler is the student. But we're going to come to find out that by the end of the war, Hitler is looking at Mussolini going, who is this guy? So, Italy's government tried to improve its economy through discipline rather than through creative economic policy. You say, what does that mean? The Italian government says, you will do this. It's for the state. Whereas the German government, they said, you will do this. It's for the state. But look, you can have fun while you're doing it. And we'll be killing some Jews behind your back. But yeah. So, the Italian policy, which was a combination of socialism and liberal laissez-faire policy, was known as corporatism. Major industries were organized into syndicates that represented both labor and management. The fascists contended that if labor and management would work to the greater good of the country, class conflict would be avoided. Nice idea, not realistic. Labor unions lost the right to strike, and management benefited from that. Management took advantage of it. After 1930s, syndicates, labor syndicates, were organized into entities called corporations. Mussolini abolished the Chamber of Deputies, the legislature, and replaced it with the Chamber of Corporations. In other words, a large committee of all the biggest businesses. This was a disaster. Corruption, bureaucracy proliferated. Surprise, surprise, in Italy. I was watching a thing just last night, Mr. Arlinghouse, about corruption in Italy, particularly the mafia is still quite active in southern Italy, and I forget what it's called. It starts with a C, but for example, one young man went in to rob, a business of some kind. I think it was a jewelry store, and just so happened a plainclothes policeman walked into the business, shot the young man who was robbing a place with a gun, and the man just happened to be the son of a longtime member of the mafia, and they actually built a shrine to the young man there next to the store. Yeah. Anyway, getting back to the matter at hand. Bureaucracy proliferated. Government loans amounted to partial government ownership of business. So the government loans you money, they own part of your business. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and the Italian economy was put on a wartime footing. The League of Nations imposed economic sanctions against Italy. The sanctions had little effect. For one thing, a lot of the countries in the League of Nations basically blew them off, like the British, for example. They allowed the Italians to use the Suez Canal because they paid money. The sanctions had little effect. Taxes in Italy rose. As time went on, the Italian state assumed more and more direction of its economy. More and more direction, we should write control of the economy. Fascism brought to Italy not economic process, but economic dislocation and a falling standard of living. It's no surprise at all that when World War II rolls around, the Italian soldiers will be some of the worst because they have no motivation. They're fighting a war for Mussolini, who has demonstrated many times he doesn't care about them. All right. When the other countries of Europe were suffering the Great Depression, Russia pushed forward a great industrial effort. Now, that doesn't mean that the people of Russia enjoyed economic prosperity, far from it, but the Russian government put their industries to work, put people to work. Russia achieved this progress only at the cost of millions of lives. That is why I say, Mr. Hollinghouse, Adolf Hitler is the grand villain of the 20th century. I still say Joseph Stalin give the guy a run for his money. I do. This proved that Stalin's earlier struggle with Trotsky had been truly political and not something about ideologies, because Stalin was doing the same thing that Trotsky wanted to do. So it's about politics. In other words, Stalin wanting to be in control versus Leon Trotsky. In 1928, the Soviet Union Party Congress had moved for rapid industrialization. Stalin called this socialism within one country, in which the Soviets would produce all the products they needed to protect themselves from being at the mercy of the capitalist powers. It's a nice idea, except once again, the Soviet economic machine could not and did not produce the quality and standard of products that your average person wanted. Stalin initiated a series of 5-year plans to implement rapid industrialization. You say, what's a 5-year plan? A 5-year plan, Joseph Stalin says, okay, in 5 years, we're going to be producing this, this, and this. And whatever steps we have to do to take them, we'll take them. Problem was, before one 5-year plan would be done, they'd figure out they weren't going to make it, so they'd adjust the 5-year plan and start another. And basically, the suffering for all this was put on the backs of the workers, the very people that communism was supposed to help. This planning was done through a state planning commission called Gosplan. Capital projects, that means big projects, building bridges, things of that nature, were consistently favored over consumer projects, steel mills, things of that nature, but they neglected things like clothing manufacturing, butter, things that people needed individually. These projects often competed rather than cooperated with each other in Russia. The workers were recruited from the countryside and lived in appalling conditions in the city that were much worse than anything Marx or Engels had ever written about in their books. In other words, Marx and Engels, when they wrote the Communist Manifesto, said, we're going to make the lives of workers better. Well, whatever lives the workers of Marx and Engels were talking about were better than what the Russians were having to live through under Joseph Stalin. The Communist Party and the government used a comprehensive propaganda campaign to recruit workers into the program, as many were displaced peasants. And so, propaganda, not just posters, radio advertisements, but also plays, those kind of things, newspaper articles. In the 1930s, laborers had to carry a workbook to document their own shortcomings. But on the other hand, there was now in Russia, or the Soviet Union, a fully employed labor force, but a labor force with a very low standard of living and no political liberties to control over their own lives. The Soviet system did, however, combine a harsh system of work discipline with the possibility of significant rewards to those who worked within the system. The results of the first three 5-year plans were impressive in the production of products. There was more rapid growth than any Western nation. Of course, during the Great Depression, that's not really a fair comparison. Large new industrial cities were built and populated by hundreds of thousands of people. Soviet Union agriculture was collectivized. That means they did away with the private individual farms. Under the Soviet system, a few farmers, the kulaks, and the kulaks were the ones that owned their own little plots and actually had made some money, became prosperous. However, they only represented 5% of the total farm population. These and other farmers often withheld their crops from the government because they could make more money bartering. They would withhold their crops, hide their grains, from the government overseers who came to collect, take them out, and they would then use them for barter so they could get more stuff. Because in the Soviet system, there was nothing to purchase with the rubles they were paid for their crops. During this time, Stalin came to the conclusion that extreme action must be taken, which meant the collectivization of all farms. That meant all farms had to be combined into large companies. You'll pardon me, Mr. Stonehouse. I need a drink. And thank you again, Mr. Hollinghouse. So, this meant recruiting peasants from the farms to work in the cities and the factories. The kulaks, the profitable small farmers, were blamed for the shortages and had to be eliminated as a class. That meant they killed them. They starved them to death. They put them in gulag in Siberia. This came to mean any farmer or peasant who resisted collectivization. This soon became a shooting war with the Communist Army fighting peasant resistance to collectivization. The number of peasants killed here is very hard to estimate. A famine also occurred in 1932, which was one of the great calamities of the 20th century. In 1928, 98% of all farms were small, peasant, individually owned land holdings. 10 years later, 90% had been collectivized. The quantity of farm products, of farm production, had increased 40%. The Soviet government now also controlled food supplies, but farmers could no longer cause political instability through protesting. Many people from now around the global community saw the Soviet experiment and reacted naively. Okay, what happened was many people, including some Americans, watched what was going on in the Soviet Union during the Great Depression, saw the numbers. In other words, they were increasing what they were producing, and visited the Soviet Union and saw some model farms that were there just for show. And they said, wow, this is really cool. All right. American writer Lincoln Steffens said, I have seen the future. And it works. And he was talking about the Soviet system. Beatrice and Sidney Webb, two socialists, called it a new civilization in the Soviet Union. The internal difficulties led to a major shift in foreign policy. In 1934, Stalin began to fear a German attack that Russia was not ready to fend off. He ordered the Comintern, that's the International Communist Party, to allow communist parties to cooperate with non-communist parties, including democracies, to fight Nazism and fascism. And if you recall, hopefully, the Soviet Union actually helped the Republican forces in Spain in the Spanish Civil War against the fascist of Hitler and Mussolini in the Spanish Civil War. The Stalinist party allowed the formation of the Popular Front government in France. Stalin's policies brought internal opposition, and this opposition had to be dealt with. And these are called purges. In other words, the changes Stalin made, people didn't like them. People both outside the party and inside the Communist Party. And so Stalin said, we got to fix this. And if you ever wonder where the film The Purge comes from, that's what it meant. The Soviets, KGB, secret police, rooted out these people who were against Stalin's policies and dealt with them. Gulag, Siberia, firing squad. December 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov, the mayor of Leningrad and a member of the Politburo, that's the communist legislature, was assassinated. Anyone who was remotely associated with anyone who knew of the murder was punished, sent to Gulag. It cannot be proven that Stalin ordered the murders to use in his own purposes. Within the party, hundreds of thousands were expelled. And I think that's all, Mr. Arlinghouse. Anyway, yeah, within the party, hundreds of thousands, within the party, the hundreds of thousands were expelled. And I'm going to stop here and begin working on the next unit. I think that takes us to Thursday, yes. And tomorrow I'll have the next unit ready to go. We will have a test, Mr. Arlinghouse, over these two units combined. This one on the Great Depression, but also one on intellectual history of the 20s and 30s. Thank you so much.